Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So I want to start this episode off with a question. So what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of the dark web? Is it the selling of personal data and credentials, illegal drugs and other illicit materials, or maybe threat actors congregating to distribute malware to one another? Regardless of what you think of, when you hear the term the dark web, it's known for a lot of things, and most of them aren't positive. But I think one thing with the dark web that kind of gets overshadowed in all this is how it actually works. So that is what we are going to get into in this episode, kind of how it works and what truly goes on down there. So be sure to stay tuned for that. But first, let's start off with our trivia question for the week. So the 24 Hours of Spa is an automotive endurance race that just wrapped up this past weekend. And what cybersecurity company was the sponsor for said race? So what cybersecurity company was the sponsor for this year's 24 Hours of Spa? And that is your trivia question for the week. So before we get into all this dark web stuff, there was a bit of a vulnerability that came up that I think we should probably talk about. And if you have been listening to the security news this past week, you're probably aware of the regression vulnerability, which is a vulnerability in OpenSSH. So what happened here is essentially a race condition. Now, if you've listened to the podcast for a while, you've probably heard me talk about race conditions before, but essentially a race condition is where multiple threads are trying to access the same data at the same time, thus overwriting something that another thread's trying to use. It can cause all kinds of issues. And the reason why race conditions are so annoying is there's no definitive way to say what thread will get there first and what is going to happen. And the reason for this is depending on the time of day, what else is going on your computer, any background processes that are going on can greatly impact which thread gets to the critical section of code first. And sometimes everything goes off without a hitch and the race condition doesn't appear, and then other times it'll happen once or twice, and then other times you'll get one value, but a different time you hit the race condition you'll get a different value. So this is why debugging anything multi-threaded or asynchronous can be such a challenge, because sometimes, like I said, these race conditions show up, sometimes they don't, sometimes they give one value, sometimes they give a different one. So it's really hard to pinpoint the exact cause and troubleshoot this, because that's the thing. Sometimes they just don't even happen. So you think you fixed the issue, and then only a few, runs of the program later, it comes back up again and you realize, okay, no, you didn't. So specifically in this SSH vulnerability, the condition happens when you reach a timeout specified in the SSH config file known as the login grace time. So when you hit this timeout, which I think by default is like 2 minutes, the SIG alarm signal gets triggered and thrown to the SSHD daemon. So essentially what this means is the program triggers an interrupt, which runs the interrupt handler. And what an interrupt handler does is if it receives an interrupt, no matter what it's doing in the code, no matter where it is, it will immediately stop, jump the program counter or wherever essentially take where I am currently in the code, pause the execution, and go jump to the code where the interrupt handler is to handle whatever interrupt has been triggered, in this case, SIG alarm, before then returning back to where you were in the program. So the function that handles the interrupt, the signal handler here specifically, so this is done asynchronously. And essentially what that means, if you haven't heard of asynchronous programming, is it's kind of multi-threaded without actually being multi-threaded. So essentially you kind of get some multi-threaded capabilities without actually having to spin up new threads. So some of the common use cases for asynchronous programming is things like I/O tasks, so things like file operations, user input, and networking are some of the big ones where you could use and make use of asynchronous programming. So this, when the signal handler gets called, it does this asynchronously, which is kind of where the problem comes in, because the signal handler calls some functions, some system calls that are not async or thread safe, which is where the potential race condition comes in. Now, I kind of, in a funny way, ironically, how this vulnerability gets its name is because this exact same vulnerability, or essentially the same vulnerability, was patched back in 2006 and then got reintroduced, I think, back in like 2020 or something like that. So the term regression it's because it's kind of regressing back to a previous state where the vulnerability is there, but it was fixed previously. So that's kind of where the name comes from. So anyway, essentially what's going on here is the attack that is being performed tries to trigger this SIG alarm handler to essentially perform heap memory corruption in order to allow for remote code execution as root, which, when you hear me say that last bit, remote code execution as root, you're probably thinking, oh boy, this is a really, really bad vulnerability, and you are correct, but as we'll get into in a little bit, it's actually not as bad as it seems. Spoiler alert, this vulnerability is very hard to trigger. So essentially what's going on here is the attacker can trigger this SIG alarm while another part of the program is running a malloc call, and essentially manipulate the memory returned from malloc, and they can essentially get an overlap of the memory returned before, essentially if they can interrupt the program's processing before malloc can essentially do its cleanup, they get this kind of overlapping hole, if you will, and in that hole they can essentially put whatever they want into there. So what they can do is, in this hole they can place a C file structure, so like the C file struct, and they can overwrite the function pointers of that file struct to point to code elsewhere, and thus they can get the remote code execution and pop a root shell, if you will. So that's essentially what they're trying to do. So the reason why this isn't exactly easy to do is because they have to repeatedly perform key exchanges with the server, both correctly and incorrectly formed certificates, in order to set up the heap in such a way that this exploit will even work in the first place. So that's big step number one. Big step number two is it takes a really long time to do this. So yes, it's bad, and it's a remote execution as root without any kind of authentication, which is by far the worst possible outcome. But as I kind of alluded to, it's not exactly the easiest thing to do. So based on the write-up, which I have linked down in the show notes below, researchers said it takes on average around 100,000 tries in order to get this race condition to happen. And mind you, each one of these tries has to wait for that login grace period. So it's not like, some script kiddies can just, run a script and boom, the exploit's done and they have root access. Now, maybe in the future that could potentially happen, but at least as of right now, that's not the case. And according to these researchers, it takes 3 to 4 hours on average to get the race condition, then another 6 to 8 hours to get the remote code execution, due to address space layout randomization, or ASLR. And essentially what address space layout randomization is a tactic used to prevent these kinds of, vulnerabilities from you easily being able to get a remote shell and have arbitrary code execution. And basically how this works is every time your program runs, rather than always having the same address space every single time, it's essentially randomized so you can't, point to memory location FFF64BC, for instance, and always hit your code every single time. It's not going to work that way. Now, not necessarily how this vulnerability happens, but one way that if you are writing exploits, you can kind of sort of try to get around this is by doing what's called a no-op slide. So if you're not familiar, a no-op is a no operation instruction. And essentially what you do is if you're writing, say, a buffer overflow exploit, for instance, what you can do is you can overflow the buffer and put a bunch of no-ops in there with your remote shell command to, give your remote shell at the very end of it. And then for your return address, when you're overwriting the buffer, you essentially point to hopefully somewhere in your no-op slide. So you'll hit that no-op slide and you'll slide directly into your remote code execution. So essentially, because it's a no-op, it's a no operation. So you just keep going to the next one until you actually get to an actual instruction. So in this case, you just keep going and going and going until you get to your code, and then you can execute your code and essentially perform the exploit that way. So that's one way that you can kind of sort of get around it. But even with that, it's not, foolproof by any stretch of the imagination. Now, it also should be worth noting that these time estimates that the researchers gave were for 32-bit systems. Now, I'm not sure about you, but 32-bit systems haven't exactly been around for a while, and the vast, vast majority of computers and servers these days are 64-bit. Now, it's not currently known if it's possible on 64-bit due to, how long it'll take and the massive address space of 64-bit machines, but it's theorized that we're talking in the realm of weeks for this exploit to actually, happen successfully anyway. So on the other hand, if you are constantly doing updates to your system and rebooting it every so often, there's a good chance that even if the attackers did somehow manage to get the race condition and we're just waiting on the luck of the address space randomization to sway their way to get the remote code execution, you might have just rebooted the system and knocked them out and then have to, restart to get the race condition again. But regardless, some of the protections that you can do to protect yourself from this vulnerability is, number one, don't publicly expose your SSH server. Now, I think that should probably be an obvious one, that you shouldn't be exposing your SSH server, because one thing you'll notice if you publicly expose an SSH server is if you look at the logs for said server, you'll notice you're getting hits from all over the place from people trying to remotely log in to your system. So that's obviously protection number one, is don't publicly expose your SSH server. Number two is to apply the latest patches to ensure you're up to date, that this vulnerability will no longer exist. And if none of those are an option, you can set your login grace time variable in your SSH config to 0, and that will essentially prevent this vulnerability from happening. But I believe there's also still a potential chance of a DDoS, but I mean, that's a lot better than someone getting remote access as root to your server. So that's the regression vulnerability. I'll have a link to a write-up about it that's very, very detailed if you're interested in learning more down in the show notes below. But with that, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. Now, on the topic of SSH, one of the best cybersecurity tips I can give if you're running any kind of SSH server is to, 1, not allow any passwords, and 2, not allow the root account to log in. Now, I know we've had this previously as a cybersecurity tip, but seeing that we have this new vulnerability in OpenSSH that came out, I figured it was worth revisiting because, the one thing you want to make sure that you have secured is SSH, because SSH essentially can give you direct access into the machine and allow you to do whatever you want to, especially if you have root privileges. Now, what I recommend you do is you do a key-based authentication. So essentially, you give the SSH server your public key, and then you can log into the server with your private key and authenticate that way, and essentially just completely drop any connection that doesn't have an authenticated key. So anyone that's trying to log in through a password, you essentially just drop the connection. Anyone trying to log in as root, don't allow it. And another thing you can also do if you want to be kind of obscuring your SSH server is you can change the port number for SSH. So by default, SSH runs on port 22, but of course you can change that to be whatever port you want it to be. Now, anyone that's trying to do some in-depth scanning of your system could still identify that you're doing SSH, even if you change the port number. So it's not like foolproof, but just a quick port scan of your system. If they don't see port 22 open, but they see port, I don't know, like 6,250 open, they're probably not going to think that that's an SSH port. Now, of course, if they did a little bit more digging, they could probably figure it out, but at a first glance, it could potentially deter some people. So, yeah, that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Make sure you have key-based authentication, don't allow passwords, and definitely don't allow root to log in through SSH. Now, before we get into the dark web stuff, why don't we get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week? So as I kind of hinted at last week unintentionally, I kind of mentioned that I was maybe going to make a new implementation of my elite encryption algorithm in Swift, and that's basically what I got up to this week. So what I currently have working is I have encrypting and decrypting working, so I'm able to encrypt text files, or really any files, encrypt just plain text. And one thing that I added in this version, which I'll probably end up going back and adding to my Java and C version, is a base 64 encoding. And the reason why I kind of wanted to do this is because especially in the Java version where you can just encrypt text, one of the issues is if you try to copy said text and paste it somewhere else and then recopy it and paste it back in, depending on what symbols or values were encrypted, it will fail to decrypt because during the copy process, things kind of get messed up. So doing a base 64 encode essentially fixes that. Now, if you're writing everything to a file, it's not as big of an issue because it's all binary data anyway. But it is something I'll probably end up getting around to doing. So as far as what's left to do, any user interaction, so pretty large chunk of it. I'll probably want to try to do directories. That's one thing I got working in C, so I'll probably try to see if I can't get that working in Swift as well. And then the last thing is key generation. So currently right now I've been just working with some hard-coded keys just for testing, and in case you're wondering, no, I did not commit that code with the hard-coded keys into version control, so I'm at least trying to be good about not encrypting secrets, committing secrets into version control, because that is definitely something you do not want to do for, I think it should be obvious reasons. And with that out of the way, let's get into some dark web stuff. And no, not DOS Dude 1's basement. So first, I think we should probably talk about a distinction between the web, the deep web, and the dark web, because I think it's probably good to kind of at least set a baseline of what we're talking about here. So the web, or the surface web, is essentially any website that's accessible to the internet with your kind of standard search engine. So this accounts for roughly 4% of the internet according to Tech Report. Now, the deep web is things that are not accessible via a search engine or that you otherwise wouldn't have access to. So things like data under password secured, information like emails, unindexed web pages, databases, and essentially anything else that you can access. You can't access without knowing the exact IP address, domain name, port number, or you don't have the credentials to access it. And this accounts for roughly 90% of the internet. And then, of course, we have the dark web. So while technically the dark web is part of the deep web, it's also kind of different, in the sense that you can't access it through normal means like you can with the deep web. So for instance, on the deep web, you can access your email, through a typical web browser, through your, normal desktop computer. But it's not the same for the dark web. For the dark web, you have to access it through the onion router, or Tor, as it's known, in order to gain access to the dark web. So, while yes, it's part of the deep web, you also kind of need your own technology, or not yours, but a separate type of technology in order to access it, which we'll get into here in a little bit. And that accounts for roughly 6% of the internet. So it also should be pointed out that as much of a bad rap as the dark web gets, and Tor in general, it should also be noted, I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this before, it was created by the United States Navy's Naval Research Lab. So yes, technically the United States government created the dark web, in case you were curious. So how do you access the dark web? So that's kind of step number one. And I think most people probably never even access it, which is partly why it has this very mystique and spookiness to it, because they don't even know how to get to it. So the main way that you access it is through the onion router, or Tor. So when you're connecting to Tor, you go through a few different steps. So your first step is you make essentially 3 different hops. So your first hop is to a guard relay, and then to a middle relay, and then to an exit relay, or they could also be called as nodes as well. So at each one of these hops, an additional layer of encryption is added, and also a different location. Your location changes as well. So for instance, if you were, say, in the UK, for instance, your first hop could be to France, and then you could go to Brazil for your second hop before you come out of your exit relay in Australia. So, and at each one of those hops, there's an additional layer of encryption. So all of these layers is kind of what gives Tor its reputation for anonymity and privacy, and also how it kind of gets the name Onion, because it's like layers on layers on layers, as Shrek said, layers. But while it can give you privacy, it also should be noted that, and I know I've mentioned this on previous episodes, the instant that you log in to any kind of account, you instantly de-anonymize yourself. Now, if your account that you're logging into, you've only ever accessed via Tor, this isn't necessarily a big deal. But if you are logging into Tor to access, say, your Facebook account because you don't want the Zuck to know who you are, I'm sorry, by logging into your Facebook account, the Zuck knows exactly who you are and what you're doing. So, yeah, if you want to remain anonymous on Tor, do not be logging into any kind of personal accounts because that instantly de-anonymizes yourself. Now, if you have accounts that you've created and access only while you're logged into Tor, that's fine. You just need to make sure that when you're not logged into Tor, you don't log into those accounts. So that's one thing that you definitely have to be cautious of. Now, because everything is encrypted, even if a bad actor is operating one of these relays, they won't really be able to gain anything from it because of all the different layers. They won't be able to identify who you're talking to, where you're connecting to, or what you're doing, because while they might be operating one of the nodes or one of the relays, there's still two other layers of encryption going on, so they're not going to be able to access any of your data. So when it comes to so that's kind of the overview of it. Now, when it actually comes to accessing it, the main way that people access Tor is through either the Tor browser itself, which you can download for free, or through an operating system like Tails, which essentially routes all of your internet traffic through Tor. Now, when it comes to actually accessing Tor, depending on where you live, certain ISPs and governments block access to Tor since the relays are public, at least for the guard relays. The first ones you access are public. Now, there are ways to get around this. There are things called bridges, which are essentially relays in the network that aren't listed in the public Tor directory, which makes it a lot harder for ISPs and governments to block them. So if you are having trouble accessing Tor, that could be one way that you could get around it, is by trying to connect via a bridge. So access, though, is just the start, though, because just because you can access the dark web doesn't mean you're going to get very far. And if you've ever tried to access the dark web and play around with it and try to see what's out there, you'll find it's very hard to do because there's dark web search engines, and I'm putting that in heavy air quotes. Even the search engines that exist on the dark web don't get everything, right? It's not there's no like Google or Yahoo or Bing or your search engine of choice that basically can get to virtually every site on the internet. That's not exactly how it works on the dark web. So in order to access sites on the dark web, you basically need to know its address. And that's where things get even more complicated, because if you've ever seen a dark web address, it does not look like your standard domain name. It does not look like, Facebook.com or Apple.com or thisisacoolwebsite.org or anything like that. It's essentially a string of random characters followed by .onion. Now, if you're wondering how these random string of characters gets generated, really all it is it's the hash of the public key of the site, and that's how the sites get their domain names. Now, while their search engines kind of do exist, kind of as I mentioned, they're hardly reliable, but there are a couple sites like the Hidden Wiki, which also has a ClearNet version, and Tor Taxi, which again is a ClearNet site. And those have some dark web links, like to various sites like Dread and some other dark web sites, but it is definitely by no means all-encompassing. And I guess now that we've kind of talked about getting access to it, we should now probably address the elephant in the room, which is all the various cybercrime and threats that go on on the dark web. So one of the big things that, of course, goes on the dark web is the trade of stolen credentials, financial information, personal data. I mean, you don't have to, watch the news for very long until you'll hear about, some data breach that happened at some company and the data was found on the dark web. I mean, it's a fairly common thing that happens these days, unfortunately, but that is one thing that does happen down there in the dark web. Of course, another thing that the dark web is very much known for is all the various illegal marketplaces that sell all kinds of illicit things, from drugs to weapons to counterfeit goods and other illegal commodities. And then, of course, you have the fun side, which, of course, I'm not using that in a real sense, but the sense that there is the selling of hacking services and tools, where hackers will essentially offer their services and tools that they have created, including malware, exploit kits like remote access Trojans, DDoS services. And that's kind of just, some of the main staples that, of course, it's known for. Now, some of the bigger, more wide-known ones, I guess, for some of these cases is, of course, you have the Silk Road, which was a marketplace that was very big and, I guess, popular amongst the dark web. And then, of course, you also had Alphabay. And then in terms of, like, some of the hacking services and tools that go on around there, there's what's called ransomware as a service, which is kind of a messed up thing, but essentially what it is you find some kind of vulnerability or exploit that you can perform, and then you essentially hire some ransomware creator to essentially be like, hey, I have this vulnerability that I can exploit. Can I essentially get you in and you deploy ransomware for me and essentially handle all the payments and decrypting and encrypting of all the stuff for me? And they're like, yep, sure, we got you. So it's a really weird business model, if you can even call it that. But it is something that exists, and I definitely don't think it's going anywhere. So there's all these threats out there. There's all this illegal stuff. So how can you actually protect yourself from this stuff? Now, I'm going to list some like services and companies and stuff, but by no means is this any kind of endorsement of them. It's just kind of what I found. So the first thing in order to protect yourself, of course, is threat intelligence. Essentially monitoring and understanding various dark web activities and, the potential ramifications of that. So one of these solutions is called Flashpoint, which is a deep and dark web intelligence focusing on threat actor activity, forums, and marketplaces. And essentially what they do is they offer tools for monitoring illicit marketplaces, forums, and chat rooms to identify potential threats and gather intelligence on cyber criminal activities. Another one is Recorded Future, which is a real-time threat intelligence by analyzing open and dark web sources and providing insights into emerging threats, threat actor activities, vulnerabilities that could impact organizations, enabling proactive threat mitigation. So essentially the point of threat intelligence is essentially be scanning the dark web constantly to see what the threat actors are getting into, what they're looking at, any kind of vulnerabilities they've recently discovered, any 0 days they're working on or exploiting. And this is, why sometimes you'll see we know that this 0 day is being actively exploited. Well, you can potentially figure that out because, you're trolling around on the threat actor forums and seeing their activity and what they're talking about and that kind of a thing. So that's threat intelligence. And the other one is dark web monitoring. So essentially monitoring, yours or an organization's or employees or whoever's kind of information and seeing if it's appearing on the dark web. So one is Dark Web ID, which is essentially a dark web monitoring platform that monitors the dark web forums, marketplaces, and other services for compromised credentials and sensitive data leaks. And then it can alert organizations if their data appears in those unauthorized areas. And then probably one that most people are probably familiar with is LifeLock, which monitors for identity theft and the use of personal information and credit card or credit score changes. And then they can essentially notify you if, your various information appears on the dark web to essentially let you know, hey, we found this information from this data leak. You might want to, change your password, for instance, or notify you if, maybe your credit card information has been leaked, and then you can, contact your bank and whatnot. And then another one is blockchain monitoring. So the dark web has a very strong tie to cryptocurrency, partly due to the decentralized nature of it. However, one of the big issues with cryptocurrency is everything is publicly viewable, meaning that any transactions you make are 100% traceable, meaning if someone knows what your wallet address is, they can see every single transaction that you make, both going in and going out. So they can essentially tell, who you're interacting with, who you're giving money to, who are you getting money from, are you cashing it out, and all that good stuff. Now, Monero is a little bit of a different story, but assuming you know someone's Monero address, you can still at least, keep tabs on the balance of their account. You might not necessarily be able to as easily track the transactions going in and out and where they're going, but you can still at least see in general, how much is in their account. So by monitoring the blockchain, in theory, you could essentially track the money all the way from the purchase of a good to the seller cashing out on some other, cashing out to, a cryptocurrency broker like a Coinbase or a Binance or something like that, and thus essentially de-anonymizing themselves. Now, of course, there are some ways that they can try to get around this through various mixers or other kinds of ways to essentially try to hide the sending of their money to essentially, try to make it harder for someone analyzing the blockchain to see where their money went. But even still, depending on how much they're trying to send through, one of these mixers, you can still potentially correlate and tie it to them, especially if it was a large sum that they sent through there. So once you kind of, when you're getting into the monitoring and in threat intelligence area, then kind of comes the point of collaborating and essentially reporting these illegal activities. So of course, and the more information that law enforcement agencies have, the quicker they can get the cyber criminals and take them down. And in cases like we mentioned earlier, like with the Silk Road and Alphabet, that was essentially how the dark web admins inevitably got caught, was because through other online activities, they were able to identify who the actual admins of these sites were, and then were able to essentially kind of do like a stakeout in order to get them. And then there was another case of a hacker that went by the name Default, which one of the reasons why he got caught was due to poor OPSEC, or operations security. Essentially what happened to him was one time he was like bragging about some of his hacks that he performed, and then the person he was bragging to kind of ratted on him, and then he got essentially taken down that way. So those are kind of some of the big ways due to poor operational security, or not keeping your criminal activity separate from your personal activity. Now, of course, I don't recommend anyone engage in any sort of criminal activity. But in these cases, that was one of the reasons they got caught, was because they didn't, fully segment the two in order to essentially keep their tracks clean. Which, if we go back to the XZ vulnerability that was discovered, that backdoor, that was one of the reasons why the security researchers assumed that it was a state-sponsored attack, because the OPSEC was just insanely good, and like we mentioned in that episode, like no mere mortal would likely have had that good of OPSEC in order to essentially keep things under wraps for that long. But anyway, when we're talking about, this monitoring and reporting things, there of course comes some ethical issues that kind of get raised, because when monitoring the dark web, it does kind of raise the question of, like, if you see something illegal, you should say something, right? And you should report it. But typically, individuals on the dark web kind of operate under the assumption of anonymity and privacy. So you could make the ethical argument that monitoring their activities without their consent could raise some ethical questions in regards to respecting their privacy. Now, some might try to argue that by committing crimes, you are willingly relinquishing your rights, which, if you live in a country like the US, for instance, that is true. If you are convicted of a crime, you do lose some of your rights. So, for instance, if you commit a felony, you essentially lose your right to vote. So, but keep in mind the fact that not everyone using the dark web is using it for malicious or illegal reasons. For instance, there are some out there that use the dark web in order to relay information that they otherwise could potentially be killed for giving out. So one common use of this is, individuals in, oppressive regimes, accessing the dark web in order to communicate with reporters to get their stories out, things like that. So there are, justifiable reasons why people use the dark web. And sometimes people just use it because they want to browse the internet without, being tracked all over the place, which, can you really blame them for wanting that? So that does kind of raise the question of, privacy versus should you invade said privacy by essentially trying to monitor things. So when it comes to cybersecurity professionals specifically and these various monitoring tools, they kind of need, at least from an ethical perspective, they need to have some clear purpose as to why they're going to be monitoring stuff. So things like protecting, an organization assets, preventing cybercrimes, mitigating risks of stakeholders. So kind of an example could be a cybersecurity firm monitors dark web forums for known stolen credentials, and then in order to protect client data, the firm deploys automated tools that can scan for mentions of compromised credentials linked to their clients, and then they can ensure that only necessary information related to the identity thefts is collected and stored, which then minimizes the intrusion into individuals' privacy. But also when we're talking about this, monitoring activities, you kind of get into some potential legal gray areas. So specifically, the dark web monitoring kind of involves border crossing activities, which could raise challenges in regards to legal jurisdictions. So, like I mentioned in the very beginning of the episode, or not the beginning of the episode, but the beginning of this segment talking about accessing Tor, when you log into Tor, you might be, in the US, but then you'll make a jump to Mexico and then make another jump to Spain, and then you'll finally come out in Norway. So you're going through all kinds of different, countries and borders, and there can be some potential legal challenges trying to get people depending on where they're located, and there's all kinds of legal ramifications and complications. So in accordance to this, cybersecurity professionals essentially have to adhere to whatever regulations that they can in involving, any kind of personal data, which can potentially prove challenging in some cases. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview of the dark web, but where do I think it's going to go from here? So the dark web is obviously not going away anytime soon. But I think one thing we talked about is, so cryptocurrency, of course, is a big part of the dark web. Whether you like it or not, whether you're a fan of cryptocurrency or you think it's the worst thing ever invented, you can't deny the strong tie between it and the dark web. And I think at this point, the secret's kind of out that any transaction you make on any kind of blockchain is essentially open for anyone to see. So I think there's going to be a rise in money laundering and the use of cryptocurrency mixers and essentially trying to hide the moving around of cryptocurrency, so it's a lot harder to track, the various uses of cryptocurrency for non-legal purchases, if you will. And I mean, we're already kind of seeing that play out, the rise in these things, and I think it's only gonna get bigger. The other thing I can see is the market whack-a-mole is just going to keep continuing. So like when the Silk Road got shut down, other marketplaces came after it. When Alphabet got shut down, more marketplaces came after it. And this is not going to stop. As bad as it is that these, sites selling all kinds of illegal material coming up, no matter how many you shut down, more are just going to pop up. That's just kind of the way it is. And I definitely don't see that happening or ending anytime soon. And I think as far as like the hacking services and tools, I think there's probably going to be an increase in that. So whatever you want to say as a service is probably going to increase. So, I mean, like I said, we're already seeing things like ransomware as a service where you essentially pay for, you get the vulnerability, you get the exploit, and then you hire someone else to deploy the ransomware and handle all of the things like encrypting the data, handling the payments, decrypting the data, and all that stuff, and then they'll give you a cut of, whatever the ransom ends up being. Or similarly, paying for DDoS attacks. So there's, the ability for you to essentially pay for some hacker group that owns a botnet of servers to, try to DDoS someone. I don't think that's going anywhere. And I think kind of this enterprise, if you will, of selling various tools and hacker things as a service is just going to keep growing and expanding. Now, when it comes to the blue side of things, or how, the defense side, how we can protect ourselves from threats on the dark web, I think like every industry, AI is going to start to play a pretty big role in this. So, we already see things like automated scripts to monitor various dark web activity. But I think we'll probably start to see a rise in not necessarily switching from these automated tools, but maybe you gather the data through these automated tools and then you use some kind of machine learning in order to try to identify patterns in the various threat intelligence data that you gathered from, the forums, marketplaces, and other activity in order to kind of identify and kind of pinpoint, where things are going in terms of what's going on in the dark web. And I think in regards to the blockchain, I already mentioned that I think kind of from the red side of things, what the threat actors are going to be doing, more of this money laundering, throwing cryptocurrency through mixers, all that good stuff. I think there's probably going to be a change to use AI in order to analyze the blockchains, in order to try to identify, where this money's actually going. Because So AI is not good at a lot of things, but one thing that AI is very good at is identifying patterns. So being able to identify patterns in the blockchain and where things are moving, I think that's going to be a pretty big use case for it in order to kind of combat some of the tactics used by the threat actors. Because at the end of the day, that's really all cybersecurity is. It's just an arms race. The threat actors come up with something, and then the blue force comes up with a defense against that something, and then the red team or the threat actors come up with another something, and then it's just this never-ending arms race of various innovation. So AI seems to be the latest hype train, and I definitely see that various cybersecurity tools and monitoring solutions are going to take advantage of it. So that's kind of in a nutshell, the dark web. So hopefully you kind of got something out of this. Of course, we didn't just say dark web bad thing happen. There's obviously a lot more to it. Hopefully, if you've never accessed the dark web before, hopefully kind of that kind of overview we gave of how you access it, the various technology that goes into it, the layers of encryption, the different hops you make. Hopefully that kind of helps demystify some of it for you, and especially how you can actually access it, because I know, some people, they hear the dark web. How do you even access the dark web? You can't access it from a normal computer. How are people getting access to it? Hopefully this kind of helped you understand how people access it and how maybe you can access it if you want to poke around down there and see what's out there, because there are some sites out there that are definitely harmless. I know Facebook has a site, the New York Times has a site. There's a lot of non-bad sites down there, but of course the bad sites of course get all of the notoriety. But before we wrap up this episode, let's get back to our trivia question for the week. So the 24 Hours of Spa is an automotive endurance race that just wrapped up this past weekend. What cybersecurity company was the sponsor for the race? If you said CrowdStrike, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And if you learned anything in this episode, I ask that you give it a rating and review and share it around to anyone that might want to learn more about the dark web. And be sure to share it with friends, family, colleagues, whoever. And if you have any questions about this episode or topics or ideas for future episodes, you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. If you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.